Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of Java in the Cloud. I've got Jeroen here with me today, and he works at an AWS partner called Luminis. Jeroen, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Mark, for having me on this awesome video podcast. I've been following you for many years, so I really enjoy this. This is one of my highlights. Yeah, so a bit about myself. I'm Jeroen. I work, like you mentioned, at the AWS consulting partner. I started my career in Java, actually. It was the primary language that I learned during my study. And I've been doing Java for about 20 plus 23 years, something like that, maybe a bit more. And yeah, in my career, I've been a Java programmer for about, Java has been, I would say, a guiding language throughout my career. And I started as a Java programmer, and now these days I work as a cloud solutions architect at Luminis in this case. And in that role, I help my customers adopt AWS, and I help them migrate their existing applications, mostly Java actually, and yeah, learning a lot of things along the way and having a lot of fun. So that's
Yeah,
how I
there's
enjoy doing
always
it.
there's always something new to learn. I mean, whenever a new application comes up, there's always something a little bit different about it, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Some of the things are quite comparable between my engagements that I have with my customers, but some of them are completely different or things that you wouldn't expect. So that's a lot of fun. Gives you a lot of challenges.
Well, a lot of this conversation is going to be about migrations because I think it's a really, really interesting topic and something that a lot of people can relate to. But before we get into that, a question that I want to ask everyone is what is your favorite technical book or near technical book?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm not sure if I have a favorite, but I'm currently reading a book which is well related to technology, but much more about career development. I have it on my desk here by coincidence, so I'll show it. It's this book by Gergely or what is it? Oros, and it's called the Software Engineer's Guidebook. And actually the reason that I started reading it and I'm highly enjoying it is that I'm a mentor at Luminis and I have a couple of mentees, which are either software developers or cloud engineers. And this book discusses sort of like the journey as a software engineer from junior to principal or staff engineer, and all the responsibilities that come along with that. Yeah, so I highly enjoy it. It's I have a lot of books that I try to read and try to stay up to date over the years, but currently I'm reading this one, and I would really recommend it.
Yeah, I mean that's something that I've really enjoyed as I've got later in my career is helping other people to kind of advance their career faster than I did. You know, what were the things that I learned that were important that I wanted to have learned earlier?
Yeah,
And I mean, a lot of that I feel like there's a certain level of grounding technical knowledge that you kind of have to learn, but then a lot of it is about people managing and working in a team and collaboration
yeah,
and discussing good news and discussing bad news and things like that and how to kind of manage projects.
yeah, yeah, and I really like that, and also like working at I would say consulting firm is sometimes also a bit different because we don't have these specific kind of roles, which are in this case described by the book that you might see at a lot of I would say bigger organizations. And so I'm trying to also see what we can adapt from that as we don't have those roles. And I try to keep people who are at the senior level to challenge them to sort of take on some of these responsibilities from what you can read in the book, like principal engineers, but then do it at the customers that we work with. And so I also try to do that myself, apply some of these concepts, and yeah, it's fun. I like it. It's
Fantastic. So far, so good. So let's talk about some of the work that you're doing at the moment. So presumably you'll have customers that come to you and ask you to build new applications on AWS. tell me a little bit about, your thought process. How do you like gather, maybe not requirements, but how do you get a picture of what they want to do, and how do you make sure that you're building something that is going to last and be useful for the customer?
Yeah. It's a broad question, Mark. It's a nice question, actually. Yeah, and it really depends a little bit on the engagements that we have. So I would say some customers, they're quite small organizations. They have sort of like a business need, so they have a specific thing that they want to do for their customers. And then we try to see how we can help them based on technology. Um, and that could be by means of AWS. Within Luminis, we have what we call a Luminis way of working, which sort of describes like our best practices. And so if we talk to a customer that has a requirement, our first option would be in general, if there's no hard requirement, we go cloud first. We pick as many managed services as possible, especially if they're a smaller customer. Um, and then we try to go from there to see what kind of technology stack we need to select. I would say we have a set of um, preferred frameworks. Let's put it like Java frameworks in that case. Um, so either Maven, Gradle, you see that a lot within these customers. Spring is a very predominant framework, I would say, for building these kind of applications. And then I think if the customer doesn't have a need, but this goes for smaller but also for bigger customers, for like multi-cloud or things like that, we prefer to pick CDK as the infrastructure as code tool. Um, yeah, and that works really well. We have a lot of people. We have sort of like internal AWS community where we share a lot of our best practices and um,
And is that something that you can reuse, because obviously CDK is describing your infrastructure as code? Do you have like your best practices codified as CDK, or is it
um,
because you're sharing code between customers? Is it a copy and paste?
no, well, we have some blueprints. So we have sort of like blueprints for, let's say, serverless applications or for container applications. And these blueprints are, I would say, split out by responsibility. So sort of like a blueprint for application. Um, we have some blueprints for setting up landing zones and things like that on AWS. And then if you go more towards, I would say, towards the application stack, we have sort of like a split out set of projects that you can use as a template. Um, and I've been thinking about creating like especially for Java projects, creating like a Maven archetype or something like that. But it depends a little bit also with CDK how we use it. So some of our engineers prefer TypeScript. Some prefer Python because we also do a lot of data-oriented projects. And people that work with Java sometimes use CDK in Java as well. So I'm sort of trying to figure out what would be a best approach for that. But
Right,
yeah,
because you might want your blueprints to be language agnostic.
yeah, yeah. But you also want to share some things. So and that's where we see that we sort of like adopt TypeScript for CDK, for instance. Um, But depending on the project, people pick their flavor, and we have a set of constructs that we sometimes also publish internally, so people can use that. Um, but I wouldn't say we're not that big, I think, yet that we need to fully standardize because we do so many projects at the same time that it really benefits us yet.
Yeah, and also there's always the kind of early over optimization in that you don't want to force everyone to be homogenous. Every
Yeah,
project is going to be different and needs to have the ability to flex and find its own
yeah.
best ways of working.
Yeah, what we do, especially when we work, for instance, with CDK, we do apply like things like CDK NAG, which applies like AWS best practices, for instance, and that's sort of like a default that we run across different projects, so we can at least all apply to those same best practices.
Right. Okay. So, if newer members of staff are building things, they can be alerted to where they've maybe gone slightly off.
Yes, yeah. and it will give them best practice on like what is it, data security, privacy, networking, things like that. It helps a lot.
And testing can be, uh, a thought process that people have. Like, how am I going to test my application if I'm using like an AWS specific service?
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about like how you manage that?
Yeah, I think that depends a bit per project. In general, in my personal experience, I've used a lot of local stack for local emulation, um, and that works out quite well, I would say. I also learned some of sort of like the caveats of that because it's of course not like a real one-to-one implementation. Um, and in the past, I worked on a project where one of the senior engineers who was a bit more experienced than me with local stack, he also said like, hey, for DynamoDB, I think I was using um, like a test on a global secondary index or something like that, or the data generated by global secondary index, and he was like, "Well, that's probably going to work slightly different in AWS than the results that you might have locally." So be careful with that. But in general, we use these kind of tools, and sometimes for instance, for one of the projects that we did, which was completely like serverless with AWS Lambda, we just spun up ephemeral environments in AWS while testing. So we have like a fully integrated solution in the cloud by itself.
Yeah, that is fantastic, and something that I used in my past roles is, yeah, if you can have an application that is completely networkless and serverless, you can not only produce ephemeral environments very easily, but very low cost, very low complexity, and it just means that every time you have a new feature, you can have a new environment, or each developer in the team can have a new environment, which is super cool.
Yeah, that helps a lot. And it really depends a bit on, of course, the application that you're working on. So for some of the customers, we work on, I would say, Java Spring applications that are deployed inside a container. And usually you just want to test that locally, do your local debug development cycle, and then something like local stack is really helpful. It saves you a lot of time because otherwise you have to deploy and
Yeah, upload those Docker images backwards and
yes,
forwards. Yeah, and
yeah,
if you're only trying to, read and write from S3 or something like that, there's probably a lot of dev cycles you can save, right?
yeah, yeah, it saves a lot.
Cool. And then maybe tell me a little bit about the operational side. What sort of tools are you using to, monitor applications and release applications?
Well, I think monitoring wise also depends, of course, on the engagement. So for our own engagement, we mostly use CloudWatch. And then, of course, we use the plethora of services because if I say CloudWatch, it sounds very simple, but um, like CloudWatch logs, alarms, dashboards,
Yeah, it
X-ray
really
for
is a
tracing. Yeah,
collection, a
yeah,
collection of tools, right?
yeah, yeah. And yeah, so I would say the plethora of tools that we find in CloudWatch. But sometimes for customer engagement, especially for larger organizations, they have sort of like a preferred solution that they want to use. And if they start from scratch, usually we advise to start with CloudWatch so they get sort of like accustomed to the AWS services. And then if there's a specific need to switch to something else, or they have a need to grow outside of the scope of AWS, then we take a look at like other services like
Yeah, it's
Datadog or
very,
something like that.
very easy to get started with the managed service. And then, if it's so pertinent to the company that you need something else, at least you can make that decision later on instead of focusing all of your time on observability or,
Yeah.
alarming. Focus on your business side first.
Yeah, and especially with things like OpenTelemetry being standards these days, it's much easier to switch actual sort of I would say metric backends and things like that than it was before OpenTelemetry.
And are you using things like Spring Boot Actuator and Prometheus? Is that still kind of the standard?
I think in most of the projects that we do, especially Spring-oriented projects, that's what we try to stick with. It gives you a lot of things out of the box, like health check endpoints and what is it, metering. Sometimes we also use Spring Cloud AWS, and then we just push metrics to CloudWatch instead of Prometheus pulling them. So that really depends a bit on the engagement. I don't think we have like a real standard for that yet.
Do you find that people, come accustomed to every single metric being visible, and then when they switch to something like CloudWatch, they have to decide which metrics are important because they're billed per metric?
Yes, eventually, yes. And it starts out very simple, like, hey, let's put all our metrics in. Let's put all the metrics that we have available, and then, of course, the dreaded AWS bill shows up, and they're like, oh, maybe we need to fine tune that a little bit.
Maybe
But on
we
the
don't
other hand,
need every JMX metric available.
yeah, definitely. So then you start to have the conversation on like what really matters for our application, what are critical KPIs that we need to measure on, and also that's what I think one of the nice things also is that also logging integrates very nicely with metrics in AWS, so that helps a lot. I still see a lot of, I would say, customers that are used to the situation where they either store metrics or they store logs. And for their logging, they have sort of like a alerting mechanism, and for their metrics, they have an alerting mechanism. And I think that's what makes CloudWatch very powerful in that sense, that you can just create metrics out of these logs based on exception patterns, based on specific packages or business logic that you have. You can really tailor it to what you want. So that's that's what I really like. That's why we usually stick with being cloud native initially within the AWS context, and then once there's a requirement, we switch over to something else.
Yeah, and I see a lot of people using integrations with simple notification service to then send an alert to Slack or
Yeah,
PagerDuty or
yeah,
email the
Teams.
CTO. Or
Yeah, yeah, and that really helps a lot how easy it is, and it's of course very well documented to properly set that up. Um, so that makes it I would say quite trivial to get going initially, and yeah, and then of course it's all in infrastructure as code, right? So you can really reproduce it easily across different customers, and that helps so much.
yeah, it helps when you can repeat similar work easily. Cool. So that's like the easier side of the work that you do,
Mhm.
building new systems, maybe having a bit more free reign and decision over your choices. But I imagine, in the line of work that you have, you're probably also working with, existing systems that maybe haven't been or have been so successful that they haven't needed to change for a while.
Yeah.
Is that an experience that you have?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's the fun part, I would say, from my consulting job is that I get to see a lot of different, the inside of a lot of different companies, but also a lot of different projects. Uh, so for some teams, they work with, I would say, quite simple Java Spring applications. But for instance, right now I work with a company that has like a product that has evolved over the last, I would say, 15 years, something like 15 to 20 years, and has multiple iterations. But you can also see that from the technology stack. So they've built some things themselves that I would say within their AWS migration. Let's see if we can replace that with an available service from AWS. So we split out the responsibilities um, and just base it on a standard solution, I would say.
Yeah, so taking like a customized specialist thing that's been built for that company and looking to try and standardize it and maybe reduce some of the risk associated to
Yeah, remove
maintaining the
some of
code.
the risk, some of the maintenance, and remove some of the code that they have. And sometimes that's easy. That really depends a bit. But sometimes also that has been like built very specific to the customer needs, and then it makes it a bit more complex to actually migrate to, I would say, a standardized component.
Yeah, I had a case recently where a customer wanted to migrate to Amazon API Gateway, and they had an existing API Gateway solution, but over time they had specialized it to have specific responses based on the calling client. So each different client would add and remove different parameters from the response, which basically muddles the kind of the business logic and the more infrastructure-y parts of the solution, which means you can't just, these are my old routes, these are my new routes, just swap them in and out. We have to decide, like, how are we going to tease apart this business logic in a sensible, pragmatic way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's also in the migration process is an interesting the conversation that you can have with your customers, because some of the customers that I have, they come from an on-premise environment where they, I would say, have very limited um, um, services available to them. So usually they just work with VMs and databases and storage and networking. And now they have this plethora of services available, like API Gateway, load balancers, what is it, WebSockets, GraphQL APIs, some of the things that they before probably also had access to, but they had to install it, manage it themselves. And then sometimes you make the architectural decision to not pick like a solution that you will need to adopt and then actually support.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're in a company where you have no experience on how to operationally run Kafka, for example, then you could imagine that being a much more dangerous risk to
Yeah,
adopting it as opposed to, I don't know, some other queue or stream technology. How
yeah.
do you find that conversation, and how do you help people to kind of bridge that thought process?
Well, I have a concrete example of something that I did recently, and this is usually like a very open conversation that I have with the customers that I engage with. Um, but I would say usually I talk about the business case or the requirements that they have, and then what I personally like to do is give them sort of like a set of different scenarios that we can adopt. So one of the I would say technical challenges that I was recently looking at was the customer I currently work with. They've built their own queuing mechanism on top of a database, which is a valid solution. Um, but that database was under a bit of pressure, so we tried to look at what parts of the system can we extract from that system. So the queue was one example. And there I said, well, let's look at what we can do both from a cost perspective and performance perspective and operational perspective, because it's not just about technology, right? They need to be able to support that as well. So there we looked at, I would say, based on the queue requirements that they have, we looked at things like SQS, Kafka, RabbitMQ, ActiveMQ, which of course are also part of Amazon MQ, but we also looked at the solution for the existing system that they were still running on premise. Should we perhaps adopt what is it, running ActiveMQ by ourselves within containers with sort of like a shared storage or something underneath? And then we just looked at all those different scenarios, wrote down the specification, wrote down cost implications, wrote out implications on culture, on learning, knowledge, and things like that. And that's sort of then I would say the second phase where we discussed that with the I would say business owners, but also with the technical people and architects within such a company. And then we try to find sort of like what would be the best fit for them. Um, and of course, as a as somebody who has been going through that, you have usually you go towards sort of like a preference, but my personal preference, but might not always be the best preference for the customer. So yeah, that's always a trade-off.
Yeah, you could imagine in that scenario there being a lot of, upfront cost if you wanted to move to a managed or an open source solution. Probably not going to have a standardized way that you can just swap from, the custom database solution to, an open source queue or a cloud native queue.
Yeah.
So there's probably a lot of potential resistance because of the initial outlay and how you're going to check that all of the different features are still going to be applicable. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
so
definitely.
complex.
And yeah, and I would say the hard part also is that um, when you start reading it from, let's say, as a person who has sort of like a global understanding of what these services do, running them in production for high volume production workloads is like a completely different thing. So yeah, that's where I usually, that's what I like, of course, about some of these managed services in AWS. You can leave that, I would say, that hard production thought process and that production challenges, you can leave that to the service provider. And I try to explain that also in my engagement, that they really need to consider that um, let's say if you do it by yourself, starting on, let's say, on premise or even in the cloud, it will give you quite a big learning curve, and of course also some risk when you start adopting these new technologies. Um, so yeah, the less risk you can impose on the team, but also on the organization. Um, yeah, I would prefer that. Let's say.
Yeah, one of the things that I found when I was, a team leader adopting AWS was that previously each of my team needed to speak to these external teams. I needed to speak to the firewall team. I needed to speak to the database team. I needed to speak to the platform team to, give me these different accesses. And then they would inevitably slow us down while we were waiting on other people's queues or backlogs.
Yeah.
Whereas as soon as we got to AWS, each of my engineers probably wasn't an expert in a database, but we didn't need an expert in a database for 99% of the time. We could, you know, boot up a database, do the schema work, upgrade the instance type when we needed to. And having all of that capability within a single API was just super clean and crisp and meant that we had a lot less like waiting on other people. And I think that alone, I think, increased the velocity of the team quite a lot.
Oh yeah, definitely. I also see that. If you look at especially some of the bigger organizations that I work with, depends a bit, of course, on their setup. But I've done quite some migrations to AWS. You see that I would say after the initial learning curve that they have about infrastructure as code, if they're not used to that, or working with particular AWS services, you can actually see their pace really increase, I would say, over time, because they are much more autonomous in that sense.
Yeah, I feel like maybe it's a bit of a broad statement, but the cognitive load that you're having to think about. Maybe you're thinking about different technologies or different AWS services, and it might seem like a lot, but most of them are just interacting with different APIs of that service, or maybe you have to understand a little bit about the IAM policies for that application. But then once you have that, there isn't really a huge amount to learn.
Uh,
But maybe that segues quite nicely into the kind of the next topic that I was interested in is how do you stay on top of the different technology changes? AWS is probably famous for kind of bombarding people with new services and new features for those services.
oh yes, definitely. Well, when it comes to AWS, I usually stick to awsnews.com. For those of you who are familiar in the AWS community, probably know it. It started, I think, as a side project by Luc van Donkersgoed. Um, and it's great to stay up to date every morning when I wake up, and I sort of try to wake up a little bit. I pull up my phone, I see the latest digest of the day before, and it gives me a good gist of all the new things that I can do, which is usually every day something new, at least a couple of things that I can do. Um, And then, of course, you always have to sort of dissect a little bit on what services do I use are really applicable to the work that I do. Um, but that's definitely one thing. Um, I what is it? I especially like reading. I would say experience stories from other people working with AWS or Java also. And So I read a lot of posts from the AWS community builders, for instance, and AWS heroes. Um, and then I sort of try to dissect mostly from, since of course, I have a bit of experience, I try to dissect a little bit the news from, okay, is this sort of like a getting started tutorial where it just gives me the diff of the gist on a service? Or does it really explain like in depth all the little nifty details that I need to be aware of? And cost is also a very interesting thing, which I read some of the posts from Jan, the Burning Monk, which it's also I read them for serverless stories, but also mostly he has some very interesting cost comparisons, which I always highly enjoy reading about, or cost saving stories from people saying, "Hey, this was our use case or our customer. We saved like a half." This morning I read a story. I can't recall from who it was, but he was sharing a story that he saved his customer like 500,000 a year, which are really big numbers if you look at it. Might not be on the total, but for me it's a big number.
That is
So
definitely, I think everyone would consider that a big number. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, I feel like one of the skills that I've gained throughout my career is looking at a piece of content and very quickly understanding at kind of what level it is, and you know, you can probably gain some increased knowledge from pretty much everything that you read, but you can skim it a lot faster and kind of find those key bits. I feel a lot easier. And yeah, I feel like I can identify something where, wow, this is really dense. I need to, be somewhere quiet, not on my phone. I need to be on a computer and I need to read this, or I need to, recently I was reading a white paper from Facebook about their use of an internal function as a code solution that they built in house. And I printed it out and I was like highlighting with a highlighter, like, wow, this is really interesting. I should consider this and like how it might, ideas for myself. So I think like based on the type of content and the depth, I actually like consume it in a different way.
yeah, same here. And but I also notice sometimes that um, just reading it doesn't always give me enough value, I would say. I'm a very, I would say, practical learner. So usually I try to get my hands dirty also a little bit to try play and fiddle around with
So
that.
do you build your own like proof of concept solutions and like oh or like side projects?
So, yeah, yeah, yeah. So one of my side projects were actually started, especially since we're also talking about Java in this podcast, in this videocast. Is like a couple of years ago, I built a serverless back then Twitter, now these days Xbot. Um, and I'm part of this community builders program, and I wanted to stay up to date on all the content being written by all these community builders, at least for the written content. And there's like a centralized place for it on the DevTools platform, but I hardly visited that platform outside of posting something or sometimes reading an article. So I was thinking about how can I easily stay up to date and read all these interesting posts. And what I actually did do a lot was using Twitter a lot, or X these days. So I built this Twitter bot, or this the community builders bot, I would say, which is parsing every half hour, I think, right now on a schedule. It's parsing the RSS feed, checking for new blog posts, enriching sort of like the information that I have. So trying to find the X handle for author of a post, and then publishing it out to X. And I just follow that account, and I've built that for both community builders and for AWS Heroes. This is sort of like my way to stay a bit up to date. Um, and I did that in Java to also, I would say, learn about new frameworks. So sometimes when I'm at the customer, they have sort of like a standard technology stack that I work with. Um, and I've done quite a bit of Java and AWS Lambda in the past. Um, so in this case, I actually there were three different functions, and I used a different, I would say, implementation for all three, all Java, but all three different. So one plain Java, one in Micronaut, and one in Quarkus. And then for the Micronaut and Quarkus, I try to also use GraalVM with native compilation to see what I would run into while actually doing this. Um, and that's sort of where it started. And about a year ago, I actually rewrote everything to use Quarkus. I really enjoyed the developer experience with Quarkus. And I also started adopting other, I would say, Java Lambda best practices. So I implemented Lambda Power Tools, Java Lambda Power Tools, for metrics, distributed tracing, properly handling of SQS queues between these different Lambda functions and different responsibilities. So Power Tools has some great features for properly doing batch processing. So if there's a lot of new blog posts, let's say, for instance, doing reInvent or something like that, I can properly handle them if one of them would fail against the API. You never know when exchanging its API policy again. So that happened quite a bit. That's also why I put in all like some SQS queues in between. So if it can't post, it will just wait until my API limit is gone again, and I can start posting again. So that's
that's a common thing that people I think sometimes fall into. Like when you start doing batch processing with queues, it's huge performance improvements and much more efficient. But actually, there's a lot of error cases that you're now introducing. If you're taking a batch of 10 and one of them fails,
yeah.
what do you do? If that single message produces an exception, the default action is that all of them will be tried again, and then you get into an idempotency problem. And
Yeah. And I actually saw that in one of our customer engagements. I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues, where he said sometimes we're sending. It was for a test environment, luckily, but we're sometimes sending additional emails. So the emails is getting received by the test user multiple times while it shouldn't. And that was because it was just handling batches, and one of them failed, and they all got put back to the queue, and then all the successful messages were being resent in the retry. So yeah, it's those little details, like getting started with some of these services is quite simple in general, but you have to really understand some of these, I would say, other scenarios, and that's where Power Tool really helps.
yeah, I think in particular the one that was helpful for me was the metrics one, because if you're coming from a Spring Boot world and you're very familiar with Actuator, or even if you're coming from a open telemetry background, you're probably not used to the fact that Lambda is an ephemeral environment. You can't hit the Actuator endpoint and collect metrics from your application. That's just not going to work.
No. Yeah, that's what I also saw when I help, for instance, customers migrate from on-prem to AWS, where we sometimes also discuss like, would this be a good fit for, let's say, AWS Lambda? Do we have very long-running processes, or can they be handled by something like API Gateway and Lambda together? Is that this mental model is completely different than what people are used to. They're just used to have a process, it's running 24/7. I can attach to it, debug it, and that's completely different in this kind of environment.
Yeah, I feel like the observability part is actually one of the sticking points on those sort of migrations. If I'm just migrating a Spring Boot Web MVC application or a Spring Web application, I can convert that to an API gateway and a Lambda quite easily. But if there are specific ties to specific observability partners, or if they have the expectation that, I don't know, all of the JMX information will be ported as well, that's going to be a sticking point, because it's just not really like a typical thing that you would do in a Lambda application. Do you find that as well?
Yeah, I see that very similar. It's people are sometimes also just used to like, hey, I set all my JMS metrics, or I set all my metrics that my application can generate because they come, for instance, from Spring Boot background. Um, they just push out everything, and if you do that, of course, also with CloudWatch, you have to be careful with your actual spend. Um, so that will increase, and it's I would say for these teams, they really have to start thinking slightly different about that. And but I think that usually is like inherent with adopting like a completely new technology or a new new way of working. And I think it's also a bit specific to, in this case, to AWS Lambda. Um, I have some conversations with some colleagues who are much more, for instance, on the Azure side, and their like functions have completely well, not completely different characteristics, but they can have sort of like longer running processes for functions. So yeah, it's something that you will need to learn and adapt while you're part of this migration, and try and see what fits and what the new world looks like.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's one of the advantages of having an AWS partner, is that you have that guide along that journey, and you can accelerate that learning process.
Yeah, definitely. But it can also be a challenge. That's why I'm happy that, for instance, that I also have colleagues who are experienced on other, for instance, let's say public cloud environments, and because sometimes we also have customers that migrate from one cloud to the other, for instance, and there you would say, well, running containers on one hyperscaler feels the same as on the other one, but there are subtle differences still.
Yeah. And you were talking about Lambda Power Tools, but I think I saw that you were contributing some changes to Power Tools as well. What were those?
Yeah, I'm trying to help out a bit in my spare time to contribute to GraalVM metadata. So as I mentioned, I was using Quarkus with native compilation, and I added power tools for that. And one of the, I would say, challenges with adopting GraalVM is that Java is very, how do you say that? You can use a lot of reflection with Java. So you can load classes without sort of like defining them, so you can load them at runtime. And the tricky part with that is that GraalVM does like ahead of time compilation, so it needs to know upfront sort of which classes it needs to include into the final resulting package. Um, and I was using Power Tools, for instance, and I had to write some of my own metadata for that when I did that like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And then I saw in version 2, which just came out, they were looking or they were adding support for GraalVM metadata for at least all the classes that are part of Lambda Power Tools. And I thought, well, let me scratch my own itch, because I have this metadata in my own project. Let's see if I can get rid of that and help out the project.
Ah, okay. So as you were building your own side project, you were having to add specific metadata for your own usage,
Yeah,
and
of
then
Power Tools.
yeah, oh, cool. So then you could take that out of your specific code base, contribute it upstream,
Yeah.
lower the number of lines of code in your own project, but also help everyone else.
Yeah, and that's what I really liked. So I worked a bit on that with the Java Lambda Power Tools team, who from AWS are working on that. And I said, well, I would love to contribute. So I started with sort of one of the utilities parameters, and now I'm sort of like trying to pick up one by one additional ones. And I'm learning a lot along the way, which is why I do these things as well about GraalVM. For instance, that if you in one of the classes, I don't think it was in Power Tools, but one of the dependencies, They were doing like I would say a lookup in one of the Java static fields. But a static field during GraalVM compilation will get instantiated at I would say build time. And it was actually looking for some environment variables, which of course were not available on my local machine. So in the actual Lambda runtime, it said, "Hey, I'm trying to." I think it was for connecting to sort of like an internal endpoint where it sends metrics or something else. And it says, "Well, I'm not running in the Java context, or sorry, in the Lambda context. So I'm trying to connect to this endpoint." And I was like, "Why is it trying to connect to that endpoint?" Um, so yeah, that was fun. I just took that library, created a snapshot version with a lot of system outs in there, just to quickly debug because you cannot really debug like native compiled code. At
Yeah,
least I haven't found a good way.
once it's compiled into a native image, you've basically got a binary, and debugging that, you can't just connect IntelliJ or VS Code or whatever.
Yeah. So that was a lot of sort of fun, and I learned quite a bit, sort of also like sort of like the tricky parts of implementing GraalVM. Because if you just do, I would say, like a native Quarkus project, they've put a lot of this metadata generation for you for the framework itself and for things that you try to adopt, even for some AWS services like X-Ray. Um, so if you adopt any other service or class or package or library, external library, you might be in for a fun ride.
Yeah, I feel like Quarkus and Micronaut and Spring have all done an amazing job of making sure that their ecosystem is very, very well supported. But it's also not always clear if something that you're bringing into your application will have that same high level of support. Um, yeah, and that's where using things like the GraalVM agent to run with your tests to see if there's anything missing,
Yeah.
I think is a really good kind of methodology to building or migrating existing applications to GraalVM native image.
Yeah, and that was the great part that was already done by the PowerTool teams, a team behind Power Tools for Java. That they already had like some examples in place where they generate the GraalVM metadata and then validate if the metadata is working by running the tests natively. So I could adopt that same concept and process. So it was a good issue to contribute to because there was already a lot of preparation done to support that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And I guess the last thing that I'm really interested in, as I see you on LinkedIn, is that you're doing more and more public speaking. How did you start with public speaking, and how are you finding that? Is that something you enjoy? Are you going to do some more?
Yeah, I actually enjoy it. Sometimes running up to the event, I enjoy it a bit less. I would say, very enthusiastic about ideas and concepts. So sometimes I shoot myself in the foot with planning and priority wise. Um, but I really like, for me personally, I like to share knowledge. That's why I find it great to be here with you. I like to share the knowledge that the experience that I've built. I like to learn from others. And that's sort of how I started. So I visited conferences and I was always looking at these speakers like, oh, these are brilliant people. They know a lot. And I was actually working for a product company, and my CTO said, I think this is sort of how I started, or maybe I was one before, but he said, well, we're sponsoring this event. We need a speaker. We think you would be a good person to share something. And I was like, oh man, what do I need to say? There are people coming into that room, and then they expect me to actually learn them something. And that's sort of where it started. And I found that was a bit more of the most challenging presentations or talks that I gave, because I was really sort of like searching for like a good presentation topic for that specific audience. But usually I just talk about the things that I do at work or that I've experienced during my career. And then usually it feels a lot less stressful because I'm just telling the story how I've experienced it. Um,
Yeah,
And
I often find the same thing. If someone is asking me to speak about a topic where I'm not familiar with, that's where the stress levels really go up, and I'm like, even on stage, I'm worried, and it doesn't feel natural. Whereas if I can talk about something that I feel like I'm an expert in, I probably had 10, 20, 50 conversations about this topic anyway. It feels like the words that are coming out of my mouth are very familiar, and yeah.
yeah, well, so, and that's how I also feel with these presentations that I do. Which one of my highlights from what is it last year was speaking at AWS Summit. Was a personal thing for me, which I really liked. In the community lounge, though, not in the on a bigger stage. That would be like a milestone for the future. Um, but yeah, I really like that, and I would say my process towards that is usually I try to look at like what did I do over the last 6 months or a year, or maybe a bit longer if it's like at AWS Summit I gave a talk about um, I would say some tools and libraries that you can use to ease the adoption of AWS and guide these teams in sort of like best practices and things like that. So that's where I shared over let's say over the last 3 years, while helping a lot of customers and teams at customers adopt AWS, like what kind of tools are there available? How does it help them from a security perspective, from a development practices perspective, from adopting infrastructure as code perspective, things like that. Um, so usually those are a bit longer and it takes me a bit more time. And otherwise, I usually always focus on a specific topic. And then my thought process usually is trying to come up with, I would say, a couple of bigger focus areas and then try to dig down that a little bit per area. Um, uh, Try to be also a bit funny in between. I'm not really like I don't consider myself a funny person, a very serious person, but try to make it a bit lightweight. And I I don't practice them a lot. I would say. Sometimes I just finished it and I sort of like have the story in my head of what I want to say, and then sometimes I forget some things, and sometimes I add some things, or um, yeah, I think that's sort of my process of how I do that. It's like it's not very structured. I've seen people like, or at least I heard them say I practiced my talk like 8 times, and yeah, that's
Yeah, I don't know how people do that either. I mean, I think if I try to say the same words every time, 8 times, I think I would feel very unnatural, and I think that would probably come across on stage, and probably people would kind of wince and probably switch off. I feel like it's much nicer for me, and it sounds like for you as well, to talk about things naturally and progress through a story.
yeah. Yeah, which of course with the downside is that you might, especially me, I know how I'm going like this, that I might divert off the path a little bit. But usually it turns out pretty well, and especially if I can do the talk multiple times, I can at least see from myself that I get better. So I also try to reflect after I've done the talk once. I recently gave a new talk at a what is it, AWS user group meetup in the Netherlands, which was actually hosted in our office. I gave a new talk on Lambda Power Tools, which since I was working on that, I thought like I don't. I learned that a lot of people are not aware of it, so I was like, okay, let's see if we can bring some awareness. And then I also tried to look at like what did I present after the first time, and does it really bring the message across, or where can I improve on specific parts of what I said? So I think that helps me also in that process of getting better, because then you can also see the interaction with the audience and the kind of questions that you get from the audience. So I get real like customer feedback.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and I think we'll include all of the links to your talks and power tools in the description in the video, because I think that's really important and people will be really interested in that. But also, uh, I think it's just fantastic, like contributing to such an open source project that people may not be familiar with, but has so many fantastic features that don't replace something like Quarkus or Micronaut or Spring, but add a specific um, feature that is specific for a Lambda runtime. And I think by using something like Lambda metrics, you really are following best practices and cost savings and performance. Um, that's really cool.
Yeah,
Well, great. Thank you very much for coming here today and sharing all this knowledge. I mean, it's been fantastic to hear from you, and we'll make sure that we include all of the links to the resources below. Thank you very much.
was great being here, Mark, and keep it going with this awesome initiative.